Okay, going to make a tier list, relatively similar to Preheats, but now slightly more updated because we are post quite a few tuning changes on the cusp of the actual raid launching. So first boss, Plexus, doesn't really matter what you play here, right? It's probably gonna die really fast. I think you could play any of the three specs you're kind of expecting to play in Prague, right? Either the Frost specs or Sunfear Arcane are kind of like what you're playing literally the entire Prague tier. So yeah, this is what it's gonna look like for the meta spec, right? Doesn't matter. You can play fire if you want to, except don't play Frostfire. But fire's a bit of an uptime spec. There's some downtime here, potentially good for Arcane. But I think you're just gonna less on pull, and there's no real ad stuff. So gonna do Lumathar next. This fight is again incredibly similar, right? Arcane's good because it has the damage amp from P2 onward, and if this boss's health matters at all, you're probably gonna lust when that damage amp happens, and if you do that, then it's pretty likely that Arcane's just gonna own the boss damage, right? But Frost is pretty good at target swapping. You kind of need that a little bit for killing the rings. They're not rings, and I think Spellslinger is pretty solid at that too. But obviously Frostfire with its glacial spikes can just shrek it. So it doesn't really matter either way. And then you're definitely not gonna put that. Ignite doesn't really spread. It doesn't seem, and I don't think it's ever gonna get close enough to the boss really to spread. So I don't think you're playing fire. And there's also just definitely no reason to play Spellslinger Arcane when Sunfury has better execute and probably better target swapping. So honestly, you could do that really because Spellslinger Arcane is terrible to play TBH with the tier set. So now for Soulbinder, I definitely think Frostfire is going to be like up here, and I think Spellslinger is probably going to be either a little bit worse. Just depends on like how the ad's health is tuned. I think that it's probably going to be tuned kind of low, and so you run into the issue where like after a week they just insta die, and I feel like that's going to be like push Spellslinger down because you need like the meteor damage from Comet Storm and Meteor for Frostfire. The 2 minute lineup for when all the ads are released is great for Frost, right? Frostfire actually really likes to run the Forgemaster trinket. Spellslinger doesn't really, though you probably could in that case. Um, and yeah, it's a little bit worse timings for Arcane, but if you need funnel, you need funnel, right? So boss health matters. You're probably gonna play a little bit of Arcane. Arcane Spellslinger actually, I would say, it gets a lot more value. Does more funnel than Sunfury, so that's solid. Frostbite dead. I do think they're gonna buff Sunfury. Like they're gonna buff Sunfury probably pretty early into the tier, I would say. So I think it's gonna be up there, but um, I'll just put it like on par kind of behind here. I definitely, especially since this is like the third boss, don't think fire's really unplayable. It doesn't really get unplayable until you get to fights where your DPS actually kind of matters. So if you're good at fire and you're like kind of mad at the other specs, this is definitely a great firefight just for how the ads work. On to Forgemaster. I'm just gonna immediately put both the Spellslinger specs in I hate myself just because their splinters are gonna fly off and hit the pylons when they're taking 99% reduced damage. So that's just not gonna happen. I think Arcane is better than Frost here just because of the damage amp that you get with Funnel in the last phase. That's massive for boss damage. Frostfire Frost, I think, is just going to do more overall damage on the fight. Because Frost, you think of like Gallywix this tier, where Arcane was the play for a lot of post prog. You were playing Fire during prog, and then in the end, it was Frost that really did all the overall damage. And that's just because it just does so much ad pad, and I think that's gonna be true here as well. You're gonna see Chochi #1 on Warcraft logs, Frost, and then everyone's gonna play Arcane for prog, unless maybe the boss damage doesn't matter and you kind of don't care. Sunfury, it's just you're not gonna play Sunfury here, so we'll put it at C. It's not unplayable, definitely more playable than these three specs. Though I'm sure Spellslinger Frost might actually do more damage than it currently until some tuning, but who knew? Apparently the boss's name is actually Soul Weaver or Forge Weaver, sorry, not Forge Master, but that's the same as Trinket. Whatever, I'm keeping it. We got Soul Hunters here. I think Spellslinger Frost, big uppies. And I would say Frostfire Frost also kind of up there. Spellslinger does a little bit better cleave. It's just the bosses jump around so much. It's kind of sus. But if you do end up taking Blizzard talents, that's actually better for like spell slinger single target because it actually does like to use Blizzard in single target with N plus talents, and you know that gives you a little bit more mobility because of the instant cast and stuff. I think Arcane's pretty solid, and I feel like they're gonna buff fire. Like they buff fire like 4% or something, and I think you're just gonna play fire here. Um, and in fact, I would actually prefer that they do that. I prefer that they buff fire by like 4%, and then we just play fire on this boss. But in case they don't, you know, I think your Frost is just kind of the pick. Arcane does pretty solid cleave though, so it's not like too out of the question to play it, and it does have really good mobility, and it's less concerned with things just like moving as much as they do, as much as like Spellslinger is, or potentially missing your Comet Storm as Frostfire is. Now we got Fractalus. I would, you know, say you're kind of gonna play any of these three specs, right? I know, oh, bolt spam, where are you gonna put Frostfire? But meh, this fight does have a decent amount of movement, and I'm just not a bolt spam believer. I'm not believing that it's like gonna outpace everything at least. Spellslinger has a little bit less issues with range because it has so much frames of frost, so it's not going to lose as many icicles to hailstones not working. And with how big this boss is, like essentially he's a Taros, we had range problems on Taros, and I think on Fractalus there's more reason for you to stand further away. So I don't think it's like out of the question for you to just play Arcane in this fight, even though it has, you know, decent bit worse patchwork sim. So yeah, and then, you know, we'll put this down here. I mean, you can maybe play fire just because of the mobility if you want to. But yeah, I think Frost is the better pick, or Arcane. If you really need mobility and are having range issues, you play Arcane. No range issues, you play Frost. Bolt spam or not, you know, whatever. Someone will play Bolt spam, but I don't think most people will. Now we got Nexus King, very similar to you know, the entire rest of the thing. I think you're gonna play one of these two, and Spellslinger is actually the worst here, just because it has, you know, it's more reliant on like longer burst windows. Frostfire during like the 15-second damage amp can really fit in some massive abilities, right? It has its Frostfire Empowerment, it has its Glacier Spike with Pyroblast, it has its Comet Storm. That's really going to lead to doing quite a lot of damage in that 15-second period. Versus, you know, Arcane also has a bit of a longer drawn out period, and then you're kind of looking at ad damage, like the ad platform. You really want to kill the big guy. That's obviously something that, you know, Arcane is great at. Frost isn't too terrible at it. So if it's not like, oh my god, he literally needs to die, then you would do, you know, Frost pretty comfortably, I feel. I don't think the two target is super relevant on this fight. You know, Frost works well for that, and Arcane's like not too big of a slouch for it. But I would say this fight's probably leaning a little bit more Frost, unless the big ad is really insane for Prio. And then obviously we have Dementius, who we haven't seen at all. I'm giving this like 4 question marks, you know. They say he's as large as Stormwind, and given Frost like range problems, that really doesn't make me feel confident. So I'm gonna go ahead and put the Frost specs in A tier, Sun Fury in S tier, and then like you're not playing those, you know, you're almost likely not playing that. So yeah, you could play Frost, but it just depends if there's any range issues. We just don't know enough about the fight, TBH. But obviously people love their tier lists, so yeah. In general, I don't know what that brings account to, but yeah, you can feel very comfortable playing Frost for a lot of progress. I do think like the fights where there's potential for numbers issues, right? You look at like Forgemaster boss damage. If you look at like, I mean, saying Lumathar or Soulbinder boss damage is also kind of troll, but you know, fights like that, that's more likely to be an Arcane fight. And then, you know, when one of the major Frost fights is Fractalus, and that can have range issues unless you're staying close to the boss. I just don't really feel comfortable saying, you know, this is a full Frost here. I think there's definitely wiggle room for either the here specs, Arcane or Frost. And it's just, yeah, you kind of play whichever. It will probably be mostly dictated by what tuning happens immediately after the race world first. And personally, you know, what I'm maybe playing is pretty much dependent on what gear I have coming out of like Mythic Plus week 1, week 2. If I was to do anything, you know, I'm kind of leaning towards Spellslinger Frost for a lot of this, just because I think their tier set's a lot more interesting. And personally, I don't think I'm gonna play Bolt Spam at all, unless, you know, I'm going into Fractalus and oh my god, all 50 of the top logs are playing Bolt Spam. Then like sure, yeah, I'll play it. But there's just no way that's the case. historically when we go for these Frostbolt type builds, the East doesn't play them, and then you end up having people doing essentially the same DPS with just a standard build. That's what happened in Nerebar, and it was about a similar gain, if not more of a gain, to play like the Frostbolt build then. But of course, technically you could play the Frostbolt build in Icelands when you need to move, and it's still a DPS gain with the standard Frost fire talents. So, there's no discount yet. I personally just don't like it. So, that's certainly giving me a bit of a lean towards one side. But anyway, interested to hear your thoughts. Obviously, there's a lot of these flying around. I literally have Kael't's open right here, so. But maybe you like mine the most. I don't know. I don't know. You can tell me what you think you're going to be playing for quite a lot of the bosses. That'd be interesting. Yeah, have a good rest of your day. I guess I'll probably include a blurb about my Patreon after this too, because I'm trying to spread some awareness about that. And then lastly, to mention, I'd made a Patreon this past week, and this is kind of like the content I'm going to be offering on it. And I have a post up there that's, for anyone, even that's not a member, to comment on about what incentives they might like to see. Some things I already have up there is like the BIS list I'm going to use for Raid as an Arcane and Frost player. I modified kind of the BIS 8 profiles to synergize them a bit more for what gear I know I will want, to be able to play both of them in progress. I'm going to be doing some, in plus commentaries and utilizing, some people's VODs from the second tier if they want, and then once a month I'm gonna do a random coaching session here, and they can also choose to have that uploaded to this Patreon as well. I've got a number of things already on here, right? I have like my current plan for the tier, my spec tier list for like each of the bosses. I have a breakdown of like all of the Mythic Plus dungeon talents and which ones I expect to be played in like what dungeons. So anyway, there's a lot of things I could do here. I just want to kind of provide consistent value if people want to support me, or just for me to like do anything fun. Like here I have a written Frost guide each season with optimizations and alternative rotations. Currently, that's like if you want to play Frostfire but cast Comet Storm on CD, that's actually a viable alternative playstyle you can do with no DPS loss. So I have a written APL for that. Or if you want like Naked Flurry at 3+ Icicles, or for Spell Slinger, there's a lot of optimizations you can do that kind of got tossed out for several reasons. So that's really what I'm thinking of including here. So feel free to check that out if you want. And thanks for rewatching the dummy commentaries. But yeah, that's about it. And I look forward to all the WoW miss spam this week.